Hello everybody, and welcome now to our periods 6 and 7 of the new redesign APUSH exam. Remember, we have our exams coming up May 8th, so hopefully these will help you. And as I said before, I'm going to go through these at a nice even pace. I don't want to take a lot of time. I'm not going to read verbatim here. You can easily pause at any moment and take some notes and just listen to some of the commentary that I make about these key concepts. Now, I added this new feature, the essential questions. As I told you, I got this from another AP teacher. But these questions will help keep you focused on what is the main ideas or points that are being expressed throughout the various periods. Here we have 4 different questions to think about. Period 6 basically is the Gilded Age time period. So it's looking at changes in transportation and technology, integration of the U.S. economy into a worldwide economic labor and migration systems. How does this influence our society? We see also that there were philosophical, moral, and scientific ideas that emerged at this time period that would defend and or challenge dominant economic and social order. How and why did new labor systems develop? Right? That's also a big part of this, and how it affected society and the lives of workers. And the final one deals with the various strategies that are developed by various groups. We see labor unions, the rise of a farmer revolt that takes place at this time period that begin to try to address the various problems of the Gilded Age. So as we go through this, if you can answer these 4 questions, you're on a good path to understanding what period 6 is about. So here's our first lump of concepts. And some of this is verbatim out of the key concept. Some of it is just me giving a little commentary on what the concept actually means. The things I underline in red are kind of pinpoint what you really need to know. Remember, there's large-scale production going on. This is the age of the robber barons, the big business, your steel corporations, your sugar trusts, the oil barons, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and those guys. Trains, though, was the real first big industry. Railroads, the first big industry of this time period. So this is what we also call the Industrial Revolution period. A lot of wealth is being developed in the United States. It led to monopolies controlled by strong men. It also allowed for a lot of corruption in business and government at the same time. This is the first time that the government begins to give subsidies to help business, especially the railroads were given land grant subsidies for them to build because the government felt they had an interest in connecting east to west. While at the same time, certain economic policies like laissez-faire developed to show why they were capitalists, while a philosophical, moral philosophy, social Darwinism, was developed to kind of justify why certain people are going to be powerful and rich and why others are not. The survival of the fittest concept comes out of, remember, this is a philosophy, social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. And this will develop at this time period. Of course, immigration is extremely important. We have the new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and parts of Asia, predominantly China, are coming to America. And big business will rely heavily on this for a cheap workforce. Various cultural and intellectual arguments, again, are developing. As we said, this is another part of the concept. So they think about it. If they say something more than once, they really want you to know it. They're just saying it in a different way now. So you had social Darwinism that was mentioned in the outline. We also have the gospel of wealth. We have social gospel that is developed at this time period. These are 3 different things that you might want to take time and try to make sure you understand why they're different. Social Darwinism, gospel of wealth, and the social gospel, which this is the one that's more of a Christian type of an idea at the time period. So make sure you differentiate between these 3 as to what they are and how they affected individuals, the social economic structure of America at this time period, and why people were challenging some of the things that were taking place as well. So a farmers' revolt will also take place because of the railroads. The railroads took advantage of the farmers out west, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and these huge areas, even now in Illinois. Illinois, remember, that's a major farming state at the time period. they began to push back first. The farmers were the first to push back. Now in green, I have this in green because the Granger movement, not part of the actual concept outline. They're in for examples. However, it would be good for you to know that it begins with the Granger movement. They're the first ones to try to regulate or control railroads. They did it in Illinois. They won a Supreme Court case, Munn versus Illinois, and I'll have that on here in a few moments for you to see it. And it looked like that they were going to win and be able to basically fight back against this big industry. 10 years later, the Supreme Court reverses their decision in the Wabash case, and big business wins out. Remember, big business used the 14th Amendment at this time period because the 14th Amendment gives you the right to property, and they begin to argue that a corporation is made up of individuals, and individuals under the 14th Amendment have the right to own their property and not have this outside regulation come on them. Eventually, as the Grangers collapse, the farmers and the Granger movement begins to slowly collapse after they lose the Wabash case. A political party, which is mentioned in the outline, the People's Party or the Populists, begin to grow, and they begin to merge their Jeffersonian agrarian ideas with the Democratic Party, and this bimetallist monetary policy emerged, where they began to feel that if they had not only gold in the system, but silver at a ratio of 16-1, this would be better for America. And this led to the famous battle, the election of 1896. And those of you might remember the children's storybook, The Wizard of Oz, is a good allegory to this time period as well. Labor unions would fare a little better, but they again would try their best to give protection to workers. They organized themselves both locally and nationally. You had the Knights of Labor, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which is the only one to survive the Gilded Age. It's still with us today, but it merged with the CIO. Some things that they were able to get, child labor laws, 40-hour weeks, work weeks, some higher wages. But there are a lot of labor strikes at this time period. Remember, you have 1877, the Great Railroad Strike. In the 1880s, you have the Haymarket Riot. Also, in the 1890s, you have the Homestead Steel Strike. You have the Pullman Strike. Often these strikes ended in violence, where the United States government would always take the side of the corporation during this time period. They saw unions as bringing in socialism and or anarchy to America, and so the government would often side against labor unions. Even the law, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was supposed to protect labor, was used quite honestly mostly against labor union instead. It's not until Theodore Roosevelt comes around will the government begin to change its ideas and begin to back up labor in a lot of these disputes. But again, here's a lot that you need to know about the rise of the labor unions. Politics are very corrupt at this time period. Governments, political parties begin to argue over the issues of tariffs, currency. Are we going to have bimetallism or just gold? Are we going to raise or lower tariffs? Should we allow corporate expansion? Should we stay strict laissez-faire economic policy? This is what's going to dominate presidential races throughout the Gilded Age. It led to a lot of corruption, both at the local, state, and national. One of the biggest corrupt moments is that Credit Mobilier scandal that happened when Ulysses S. Grant was president. This is also the same time the rise of a massive urban society. Big cities now are emerging. New York, Chicago, San Francisco. These are becoming major metropolitans in America, but allowed for the rise of the political machines. These political bosses, they used immigrants as a power base, gave them some social services in exchange for their political support. That's important to note. They got them jobs, homes, certain services, but they had to vote the way they wanted them to vote, and thereby they were able to control a lot of things politically at this time period. Of course, certain individuals began to see a way to try and help immigrants by creating settlement houses, homes where immigrants can come, bring their families, and better assimilate into American culture. The most famous is Jane Addams' Hull House at this time period. So that's always good to take note of as well. Again, immigration led to a lot of racist theories and a lot of nativist America for America first. Of course, The Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation is allowed. This is also a huge component of the Gilded Age. In the South, eventually the development of Jim Crow law will come out of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. A lot of activists, though, begin to articulate alternative visions of political and social economic equality for both African Americans and women. Right? You have a women's suffrage movement is starting to begin again in the 1880s, 1890s. You have Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois who are fighting for their various ideas of how to accept or fight against segregation. A lot of migration within the United States to the American West after the Civil War has taken place as well, which eventually leads to the end of free American Indians roaming the West. The last of the Great Plains Indian Wars takes place between the 1870s and 1880s. Custer's Last Stand is happening at this time, the Battle of the Red River in Texas. So we're seeing the end of the Indian Wars, and the end also of Indian culture takes place. You get the Dawes Act takes place, the Severity Act, trying to teach Indians to become landowners and stop roaming the land, which eventually really hurts their culture. Here are some, again, outside examples that you could use. A lot of different things. Here's the Lund case I was mentioning that uphold Granger law, and then 10 years later the Wabash case overthrew it. Various things that deal with labor, the Knights of Labor, Homestead Steel Strike, Haymarket Riot, Pullman strikes. Won Kim Ark is a Supreme Court case about the 14th Amendment. Remember, the Chinese are the only group of people ever excluded from migrating to America. But what about those who are born here? Do they get citizenship under the 14th Amendment? Well, yes. Dawes Severity Act, again, that's what I was mentioning about Indians. There's the Hull House, Jane Addams. So there's a lot of things here you could use as examples in writing short answers, DBQ essays, and of course long essays. Which brings us now to period 7. This is now the progressive era. So here are 4 different questions about, we see one deals with progressivism. The second one is talking about changing role in our foreign policy, moving from isolationism to full-on intervention, starting with the Spanish-American War, then World War I and World War II are also part of period 7. Of course, the Great Depression is a major component here as well. Good things to know, this is all period 7. And then eventually, after World War II, the changing of domestic social changes and the debates over civil liberties, the precursor to the Civil Rights Movement, which is going to be actually in period 8. So here are your concepts to be aware of when it comes to progressive reformers. They want government to intervene in the economy. They want to expand democracy to all Americans. They want greater social justice. They also believe in conservation of natural resources, something that Theodore Roosevelt himself will be very, very pro at, and there will be a lot of national parks will be established under his presidency. The progressive reformers, you should know, are mostly urban middle-class individuals, most of which are female, but a lot of males. These journalists, you may remember Theodore Roosevelt dubbed them the muckrakers. These were these investigative journalists. They began to look at the corruption of what was happening in the cities, what was happening in government, what was happening in big business. And so very important to take note of as well. That's also part of the progressive era. The early 20th century, they also promoted federal legislation. Eventually you get different acts are going to be passed. Theodore Roosevelt will get our Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug Acts are passed. With Woodrow Wilson becoming president, he will marry progressivism completely to the Democratic Party, and we get a Clayton Antitrust Act, a stronger progressive law to try to look at regulating big business. So all this is happening now in the early 20th century. Again, another big theme, one of our essential questions, talked about moving from isolationism, which began with George Washington's farewell address. Now we're going more into overseas intervention and overseas expansion. Spanish-American War, which is mentioned in the outline. World War II is mentioned in the outline. World War I, I should start World War I, World War II. These are all mentioned in our outlines, and they give us a breakdown of how we gradually move more towards intervention. Remember, under Woodrow Wilson, again, he is mentioned verbatim right there in the outline. His idea was the defense of humanitarian and democratic principles. If you remember in his war speech, he said he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. That's a very progressive understanding, and it's putting America at a forefront of bringing what he feels is more freedom and democracy to the world. Of course, at home, freedom of speech will be limited. Right here, limiting of certain civil liberties. We get an Espionage Act. We get a Sedition Act. If you're not with us, you're against us. While we might be preaching freedom for the world, we also don't want anyone talking out against what we're doing at the same time, pointing out some of the hypocrisy of America that's going on. Of course, even though the United States played a very small role in winning World War I, Wilson will come to dominate the meetings at Versailles and the subsequent peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, which led to a League of Nations, which the United States, if you remember, never joins because the Republican Party objects to losing the power of declaring war under Article 10. A great migration takes place for the first time with African Americans. During World War I, this will break the cycle of sharecropping. They're pursuing new economic opportunities. They're pursuing jobs. An even bigger one will come in World War II. The 1920s then saw an end to progressivism for that decade and a return to more conservative thought. You have the Republican presidents of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and it ends with Herbert Hoover and the Great Crash. But the 1920s is an explosion of both artistic thought through the Harlem Renaissance, jazz music, and poetry. We also experience a Red Scare at this time period. A lot of immigrants are coming after World War I, some of which may be communist, and Americans began to fear this in a series of immigration quota acts to try to limit the number of immigrants that can come here. But again, it's also a great time of new technologies, radio, airplanes, right? Just wonderful. The silent movie era takes place in the 1920s. So again, pause and think about this yourself and look up some of this stuff in our textbook. The 20s will end with the beginning of the Great Depression with the stock market crash of 1929. Progressivism comes back throughout Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Remember, when you think the New Deal, you always have to think in the 3 R's. Providing relief to the poor, stimulating recovery of the economy, and reform of the American economy. So relief, recovery, reform. They're in the key concepts. That's how the New Deal is broken down. It's a series of government law. These are laws that are developed by the Congress that becomes very progressive under Roosevelt's tutelage and his leanings. Eventually gets him in trouble with the Supreme Court because he gets too much legislative power to create law. He also comes at odds with extreme radicals. There are certain socialists in America who don't believe the New Deal is social enough. Also labor unions and various populist movements. Eventually, the New Deal, it is a debatable thing. How strong was the New Deal from 1933 through 1941 with Americans' involvement in World War II? How much help did it bring? And it depends on how you look at things. Some can look at this and say, yes, there was a great legacy of great reform. There was a helping of individuals. Some also argue then that it created a huge government that became unresponsive to the people and spent way too much money. But in any ways, it's a major part of our history, and it has. If you look at from that point on, every president, Republican or Democrat, is going to have some form of progressive ideology with him. He's going to have his own form of a New Deal at some time or another. World War II obviously is a major turning point in American history. The attack on Pearl Harbor changes America forever. We will never be an isolated nation ever again. We have taken the position of a global political and military leader and will be until someone displaces us. A mass mobilization. Look at that! I just made up a word there. Mobilization of American workforce. Women, especially will spearhead this. Your Rosie the Riveters, right? We can do it, right? That great poster. America goes to work by the millions. And that's something that neither the Germans, the Italians, or the Japanese truly understood what would happen if you went to war. However, a major part of America was excluded, Japanese Americans. Now, they don't, I said a major part, they're a minority group, but again, they could have easily contributed to our great mobilization of work, but instead they were put in internment camps. After a while, certain one of them will get work relief at times where they can go out and work, especially in agriculture and picking peas and other forms of vegetables. Mexican migrant workers, very important. We began to lower the restrictions on their migration to America. America is going to depend on them desperately to help us grow our food, even though it still brings about a lot of racism. The Zoot Suit riots that take place in California, for instance. Now, a combination of factors is what helped the United States, along with its allies, to win the war, including, it says, allied political and military cooperation. You have the Atlantic Charter that was produced between the United States and Great Britain at this time period. 8 points that talk for the total surrender of the German people. It also put in there the stipulation to bring back a type of League of Nations that eventually becomes our United Nations. Of course, the technological and scientific advantages, we dropped 2 atomic bombs in Japan. All right, that's what that's telling us right there. Here are some major events throughout the Progressive Era. Remember, it begins around 1901, and it goes all the way through World War II, period 7. So you have everything from the square deal to muckrakers there. Big stick and dollar diplomacy that are taking place between Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy and William Howard Taft. There's the League of Nations, Jazz Age. Remember Alice Paul. Women fought for their rights during World War I and finally got their right to vote because of Alice Paul's hunger strike and the 19th Amendment. Margaret Sanger, also very important. She is a doctor who worked hard for women to have rights to birth control, which is a very important thing today. And here is, again, a lot of other different things that you can look up and think about how you could utilize either in a short answer, long essay, or a DBQ. All right, that's it for period 6 and 7. Now you have to do periods 8 and 9, and we'll be done and hopefully ready for this exam. Talk with you guys later.